Welcome back to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Rondo Moses.
And I'm Matt Tice. This is a podcast about challenger thinking in a world shaped by disruption.
And in every episode, we explore the strategies and leadership mindsets that help businesses break from the pack and stay ahead in fast-changing markets.
And every week, you'll hear conversations, case studies, and insights from leaders who are applying these mindsets to thrive in this uncertain environment.
So to subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and check out our companion articles at insurgentsgroup.com for a summary of takeaways from each episode. Now, let's get into today's conversation.
All right, Rondo. Today, we're going to explore a little bit about kind of on our ongoing theme about productivity. We've had a number of questions from our audience about the difference between productivity and efficiency, particularly at the firm level. What does it mean for me as a business owner or as a business leader? So we thought it'd be interesting to unpack this issue a little bit and kind of bring some light to the contrast between perhaps productivity, efficiency, and maybe even effectiveness. So that's the topic, Rondo. So why don't you get us started? Give us a 50,000 foot overview around, the topic and why is it important for leaders to be considering in this time?
Yeah, I think just stepping back also to the prior episode when we talked about productivity, we said it really isn't about doing more, it's about creating value, delivering value. And, today we're going to look at that flip side, which is what happens when companies, really think about efficiency a lot. And efficiency, from my perspective, is doing the right things, like sort of optimizing the ratio of input to output. And in some cases, it's about eliminating waste, right? So you're getting out the quality output. Whereas productivity is doing the right thing. So you're really focused on more creating the value and strategic impact as opposed to the output itself. To doing things right versus doing the right thing, to me, is a big distinction that we want to get at in this conversation.
Sure. I mean, I think in some ways there's like this triangle almost of, efficiency, doing it right. And to your point, is, the least possible waste, the highest quality per unit, right? So making sure that we're getting that unit is being created in a way that's using our resources in the most efficient possible way, which is largely the productivity denominator, right? Which is
Hmm.
input. And if we look at productivity as gross output over input, typically measured in labor hours, and then effectiveness, that part of productivity, which is like you said a moment ago, doing the right thing. So and often firms fall into this trap of being highly efficient or putting a lot of energy into efficiency on things that don't really matter. So you
Right.
could have, for example, the most efficient payroll, which is perfectly fine. But if you're disproportionately investing in that and you're not a payroll company, then potentially what you're doing is leaving value on the table that doesn't turn into overall firm productivity. So I think it's
Yeah.
really important to understand, like, to me, this is a resource allocation problem. We have finite resources, and how do we make sure our investment in doing the right things right is focused on the things that are going to generate the most output per unit of effort, right? So to
Yeah.
me, that's the solving that we have to do with the productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness triangle.
I think the other tension, though, is that a lot of leaders and companies think that see efficiency as the goal. So they see efficiency as really improving in essence, improving productivity. Whereas efficiency is a tool that should help them with productivity. Because efficiency, if you're just looking at efficiency as cutting costs and reducing costs, then cutting waste to your earlier point, then you're not really necessarily driving up productivity because ultimately productivity to me is, are you creating more value for the market or value for customers? Like ultimately, that's where productivity should lead you. And I think that when you think only about efficiency, it seems to translate into just cost. But how do people think about efficiency? How do they use efficiency then to fuel productivity would be the best way to think about it.
Right. I mean, you ideally should have both, right? So, if you think about like a mental map of a 2 by 2 matrix where you have high productivity and high efficiency in the upper right-hand quadrant and low in the lower right-hand quadrant, it's possible to be highly productive and not very efficient, although less
Hmm.
likely. It's also equally possible to be highly efficient with low productivity because precisely as you've described, maybe you create those widgets or whatever it is that you're delivering with zero waste, high quality, but they may not be the right ones that the customer wants, right? They may not be
Right.
delivered with an experience that the customer values. They may not be priced correctly, et cetera, all things which contribute to uh, the numerator, the output. So we could be really highly efficient, but not necessarily focusing on those things to your point that generate value for customers and therefore create that output. So I think finding that balance is really quite important. But of course, if if we've got the right recipe for the customer and we're wasting resources on the way through, then that creates a problem in a sense that potentially we're not able to deploy our limited resources to create more output, therefore more productivity. So I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was saying too is that, yeah, you can focus on savings, but how are you then deploying those savings to improve productivity? For example, are you investing in technology? Are you investing in capabilities that will support the organization's ability to deliver value to customers or create more value in the market? That to me is really where I think the missed opportunity is. Too often they're looking at cutting costs and improving margin, but not investing back into the capabilities of the business or the business itself in general.
Okay, so then I guess if I understand what you're saying correctly, is if I've made those investments to, say, streamline a process, um, take the waste out of that process, make sure that it's delivering quality every single time through the first pass, whatever that might be. I've got a stable system that that process is delivering a reliable product, right? So I've
Right,
made the investment to do that. So we've taken waste out of the business, therefore we could make the argument in taking that waste out of the business, we've freed up resources, and that could be we've freed up capital. The machine can make more widgets, right? Or
right,
we've freed up labor. That labor has an opportunity cost, and that labor can do something else. Then the question is, where do I reinvest that labor to create more output, right? Which is obviously going to drive productivity in your case, as you described, do I take the dividend of making that investment in efficiency to take out cost and realize that value in the short term by reducing my cost line? Or, or maybe it's an and, do I reinvest that incremental unit of freed up resource to invest in more output? Is that
right.
the point?
That's the point. Right.
Yep,
Maybe to your point, it's a fraction of that incremental savings could be invested in something else that will support the future business, right? So currently you've improved the current operation, but is there some investment that you need to make to support the value creation for the future of the organization? Whether, like I said, whether it's a technology, whether there's some capability building that happens in the organization, whether it's investing in, capital. When we talk about the connections in the organization, so that you build trust in the organization, right? These are the intangibles that are not necessarily captured in labor and capital that will also add value to productivity of
sure.
the organization.
And I guess if I extrapolate your point a little bit, is that investments in efficiency will free up that capital. So then the strategic question is, how do I reinvest that capital, right?
Right.
Do I take that as, do I give that back to the shareholder right now, or do I invest in the capability and capacity to deliver more output in the future? I think there's an interesting follow-on question, particularly in this world of AI and digitization that is kind of come on the scene. Um, where do you focus, Rondo? So always we have limited resources, and do we want every process universally to be at maximum efficiency all the time, or is there some rubric that we can use to evaluate which processes in which order get attention?
Oh, I think it has to start first by asking, does this process directly impact the customer value to customers? I think that's the first step. And if it's not, then I think it's not your highest priority because you really want to focus on ultimately productivity, as I'm seeing it, is how you create value for customers, how you create value in the market. And so if there's a way for you to focus on customers and do that, that's great. If you're able to be efficient in other areas that are not necessarily customer facing, but you're committed to investing those savings that you get from those more efficient back office processes into the customer or the market or inside the know-how of the organization, then that makes a lot of sense. But it's being very intentional and disciplined as a company about how you reinvest or where reinvesting those savings from those non-customer facing processes.
Okay,
I
so the
think,
customer, and we love this, Rondo, right? So the customer always being your kind of first port of call. Does it matter to the
yes,
customer? If so, do more of that and do less of other
right.
things if you have to. So I completely agree with that. So I think that's a great starting point in a sense that, in other words, investing in efficiency in areas that can create greater output, i.e., greater value for customers, is sort of your first port of call. I guess another way to look at that is where there are constraints in your business that are preventing that value from reaching the customer. That
Hmm.
gives you a pretty strong clue to where to focus your energy to drive that efficiency. I think it was really interesting. I saw that many of our clients got quite lazy in sort of, let's call it, the 2011 to 2022, or even let's say, well, COVID was 2020. Yeah, sort of 2011 to 2020 when the cost of capital was really low. People aren't worried too much about quality of inventory, things like that. Kind of people got quite a lot lazy on those aspects. But now we're seeing as things are much tighter, you have less resources to invest. And I think that many firms are really unaware of where the bottlenecks in their big workflows are that create that value to their customer and don't
Mm.
sort of laser focus their energy on improving efficiency in those areas. So, to me, I think that's always a key opportunity. And I think then the third tier is um, we do need to equip the workforce to be efficient, right? So obviously waste is a problem. So I think those who are quality and efficiency purists listening to what we're saying would be saying, hang on a minute, hang on a minute. We need efficiency in all things that we do. Otherwise, we're wasting valuable resources that could be deployed elsewhere. And I obviously completely agree with that. But the challenge is that the leadership and the leadership mindset of where to focus my investment is really quite important. And that
Yeah.
too is a limited resource. So, how do you then equip your whole workforce to understand how to do what they do at the unit level efficiently and not waste resources and deliver a quality output, but be mindful of the things that are going to um, make a greater impact on overall firm output and have line of sight to the customer? I think both of those are important. Would you agree?
No, I agree. I just think that there has to be an agreement, an alignment on to what end, right? So efficiency is the means to some end that you're trying to achieve, whether again, and ultimately it should be about creating more value for the customer. So how do you help people understand that when you become more efficient in your role, whether it's a support function or a customer facing group, we're able to then invest additional resources to generate more value for our customers, generate more value in the market, further differentiate us in the market. Like to me, like that's the missing link. It seems to be sometimes efficiency for efficiency's sake, and not because efficiency is going to serve the purpose of driving ultimately the productivity that we want. But they're not one and the same. But I think some people use them interchangeably, and they're not one and the same.
Okay, that's fair. So now let's talk about technology coming onto the scene, right? AI, other things. How do we think about how to apply emerging technology to these problem sets, Rondo?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons why organizations are struggling to see the productivity impact from AI is because they've been using AI only for efficiency purposes to cut costs. And they haven't been thinking about, well, how do we adjust? We talked about this in the prior episode when we talked about productivity. How do I, redesign workflows to be more, linked to creating customer value? And that's not happened yet. So having that translation to say, okay, we've been able to apply AI, we've found ways to cut costs, but now how do we, hopefully they're reinvesting that, but how do we use it then to create more value for customers, whether it's improving customer touch points or creating new touch points to create more value for the customer? I think that's what's missing. How do you use it to improve customer lifetime value? How do you use it to improve customer retention? Like those kinds of things, I think, become really where the strategic impact of AI will, I think, be noticeable.
Okay, so that's good. And so far, I think we've said it before, but you know, AI seems to be showing up everywhere, but the productivity statistics, right?
Right?
And from that point of view, I agree with you. The notion of where do I invest in technology, which it could include AI, but to me, it comes down to those investments that help me create the capacity to create more value are the better investments than those investments that are to create unit level efficiency that may or may not be connected to that outcome that we just discussed. So I think
Hmm.
that's a good lens to be able to use. And I do agree that like peanut butter, spreading these investments across lots of processes without that sort of overall perspective on that capacity to create more value is a lost opportunity for many firms in this particular part of the cycle.
Hmm. Yeah, so for example, in the education organization where I'm on the board, our team uses AI and they're using it across the organization, but they have different use cases. And one of the use cases that we certainly look at is how do we use it to improve teacher effectiveness? How can teachers leverage AI? How can it ultimately be used? And ultimately, if you can improve the teacher effectiveness, you can improve the outcome of student performance in the school, which to me is the ultimate productivity outcome. So improve student learning, improve students' ability to, graduate from and go on to college and graduate from college. Like those would ultimately be the outcomes that we want to really drive. How do you leverage AI to help with those ultimate goals in an organization?
Yeah, I've got a fun little story too. Having worked with an agricultural business, looking at the question that they raised was, where can I use AI in my business to make our business more efficient, right? And so doing lots of experiments, everything from the billing system to how many steps do I walk across the farm? Where do I paddock
Mm.
my sheep and things like that? And when we started talking to this particular client, um, I tried to ask the one question, which was, how do any of these investments affect your yield? And it was interesting that the client
Mm.
didn't answer that question, right? So that line of sight to these investments to improving agricultural yield was a miss. And I said to him,
Right.
well, there's really no other question that you can ask, right? So if you can't see line of sight to any of these investments that you're making on AI to improve these different areas of efficiency in your business, and there's no line of sight to yield improvement, which is fundamentally your output metric or your productivity metric, um,
Hmm.
that's a miss for you. So I found that conversation to be really enlightening, sort of unpacking this with the client. And over an hour or two, we started to realize, well, hang on a minute. This investment over here has no line of sight to yield. Maybe we should pull back resources on this one and put more resources over here where there is line of sight to yield, for example. And that became a very productive space to start talking about, and particularly in agriculture where resources are extremely constrained. Um,
Hmm.
only can make a few really targeted investments that are going to make a difference, how do I focus that energy? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that's really important.
And I think to your point, I think that a lot of organizations, when you look at their metrics, they have a lot more efficiency metrics, very few productivity metrics. And I
That,
think that that is an opportunity for companies to sort of really look back. So, for example, people will easily say, "Oh, we can look at our revenue per employee." That's not a productivity measure. That's an efficiency measure, right? So, as an example. And I think that there's a opportunity to help companies really think more strategically about what are the measures that really communicate value creation for our customers. Like I said earlier, customer lifetime value growth, um, their growth of net promoter score. It could be another one, just for example, on innovation, the time to market could be a value creation metric, productivity metric that you look at. Like, so getting companies to really think more strategically about what are the metrics that really speak to productivity as opposed to efficiency, because those are the metrics that would really be more appropriate for their strategic view, as opposed to the efficiency metrics are more operational as opposed to strategic.
right. So the way I keep thinking about that is, efficiency is about the denominator and productivity is more about the numerator in
The
this,
numerator,
really
right?
focusing on those output, the things that drive output, at a fixed level of capital or resource. So now I'm not saying that they're always fixed, but just that's how the metric ends up working. Okay, so I think that and you're right. I think because the metrics for efficiency are more mature and easier to pin down. Although I wouldn't
Easy to
take
pin down.
exception to the idea that revenue per employee can be a productivity metric, but we won't parse that. But I guess, okay, from that point of view, though, um, as we start to think about how to improve efficiency in our business, if we accept that we should focus our limited resources on the things that are going to create the capacity to create more value, that's the goal, right?
Hmm.
That's, we can use a term for that. That's called throughput. Okay. And so understanding that, I'm amazed, particularly for mid-market businesses in particular, um, how immature many businesses are in terms of their application of methodology to improve efficiency in particular, but productivity as well. But for example, the Toyota production system is arguably the gold standard um, for efficient operating in a firm, which
Yeah,
has been, it's sort of gone through several different incarnations over the last couple decades. It started off probably as TQM, evolved into Six Sigma, and now is widely understood to be lean.
right.
But even still, in many of the companies that we work with, these lean philosophies are not deeply embedded, even in some manufacturing businesses where we would expect them, and certainly not in services businesses. So I find that to be a real miss that, a lot of firms don't have deliberate and intentional investment in the programs that are going to help lift these things, right? So
Mm,
let alone productivity. Similarly, at least here in Australia and certainly in Asia Pacific, um, the the penetration of techniques like discrete event simulation to model how we might allocate resources um, to improve throughput. Never see that. It's virtually unseen. And increasingly, even though the technology is becoming much cheaper, we don't see a lot of penetration in digital twin either, which is now probably, the convergence of all these capabilities to create a digital copy of a business to monitor it in real time in the first instance. But in the second instance, so if you're building a factory, for example, um,
hmm.
creating a digital incarnation of that factory to understand how to iron out your workflows before you spend 3, 4, 500 million to implement that factory is a small investment to get a high return in terms of, getting the best out of that capital that you're deploying for those investments. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done on just getting in and bedding down the capability to create more of that capacity. And that's three examples where firms could explore further to find opportunities to make to build more efficiency and then to apply that efficiency to create greater productivity.
So I was going to say, so are you suggesting that some of the challenge with companies not achieving their productivity or improving productivity is because they haven't focused enough on efficiency or applied some of these tools of inefficiency to their organization?
Well, I think if we accept the original premise that being efficient in the right things definitely has a productivity impact, right? So
Hmm. Hmm.
if that's true, then having the discipline to improve efficiency in those right things matters. So I guess I was just trying to relate that I don't see a lot of the techniques that are available to firms being employed at any scale, particularly in mid-market firms, although in the Fortune 100, Fortune 500, these will be quite commonplace. But
Right,
you know, as these firms consolidate and take more advantage of scale to create more output, it puts mid-market firms more at a disadvantage, and they need to invest harder to keep up. So that's
mm,
why, to my point, I think we need to see more of that sort of investment. I guess on the other side of it is when we think about productivity, it's kind of taking a total system view of your business, right?
right,
Because in other words, in order
right,
to understand which widgets do I sell to which customers in which order, that's typically something that's owned by the marketing team, right? And being able to make sure that I have an efficient approach to deliver on the widgets that create the most value and prioritize that is an operations problem. And
right.
I don't see, again, many firms applying a more total system view to how to think about balancing productivity and efficiency either. So I think we're just leaving a lot of value on the table in not exploring these things correctly. And the thing is, I don't want to go as far as to say it's laziness because, many of these techniques are certainly widely available. They're relatively easy to implement, but firms, for whatever reason, either haven't educated themselves about these tools and techniques or methods, nor have they gone to the trouble of implementing them. And maybe sometimes it's because it's too hard, or you get dogmatic practitioners of these tools that create these um, unwieldy sort of approaches that are, less efficient perhaps than the value that they're purporting to create. But I'm not sure. But I just see that there's been particularly in this period of previous growth that we've had, a real slacking off on these methods.
Yeah, I think you raised an interesting point. I think that the efficiency focus has been solely on the individual units or functions and not thought about from a system-wide perspective. So more thinking about end-to-end processes as opposed to, handoffs of throwing something over to the next group would I think be a way to leverage efficiency in a way that really supports increasing productivity as opposed to just optimizing that individual area. You're optimizing system wide. And I think that there is a big opportunity for, to your point, for companies to focus on how do we optimize the system as opposed to just individual areas.
Yeah, and there are tools to do that, like value stream mapping, which is a key part of lean, where
Right.
I don't know how many clients that I've gone to show me your value stream maps, and even senior chief operating officer types or head of operations will look at me like I've got two heads. Like, what are you talking
Right.
about? You know what I mean? Like, where is this stuff? And yeah, I think again we're just leaving opportunity on the table. But I guess, coming back to the main point is if our goal is to deploy our limited resources to create more value, right? I.e., more output, that value for customer translates into output. Um, There's also, I think, a financial story here too, which is, and this is quite important, is the efficiency at which we allocate our limited resources is a driver that we don't talk about very often. Um,
Hmm.
and even many CFOs that I'll speak to find that to be a challenging concept, right? So, what is your concept, for example? This might be a question. What is your concept for efficiently allocating resources to the best opportunities? It ends up being the budget, but that isn't really what we're talking about. We're talking
Right.
about funneling resources to where, to where that value, where those value opportunities are, and having a high refresh rate in terms of reallocating capital and labor all the time. And I find that the traditional budget process really wanting in most organizations. It isn't necessarily an efficient way to allocate those resources. So I think there's an efficiency problem there too, where often we think about finance sitting over the top of the business, but their role is nothing more than to efficiently allocate capital to generate output. But I don't find many CFOs, certainly again in mid-market businesses, really seeing their role in that sort of frame.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, there's like you said, is a great place to apply some of these principles, but will they pick it up? And so, what do you think is the barrier to them picking it up?
I think what happens, and let me just, before I answer that question, which is a great question, I just want to say also the same thing happens in people and culture, or they used to call it HR, where
Hmm.
the people and culture leaders don't necessarily see their role as how do I support the business to efficiently allocate labor to generate more output, right?
Hmm.
That's the
Hmm.
only question that really matters. And
Hmm.
I don't, like if you ask a chief HR officer, a chief people and culture officer, what's your primary function? I promise you that maybe 1 in 10 will give that answer, right? So,
Hmm.
but anyway, so coming back to you, what is the barrier? Um, I think because we have these highly functionalized structures, which are built in, largely command and control pyramids, which are designed to create unit level functional efficiency at the expense of system efficiency, right? It's just by
Right.
design. You start with top line KPIs, which then get cascaded down into functional KPIs, which are, to your point, um, will prioritize those metrics that are about delivering that functional role efficiently, but not necessarily prioritize how that functional role contributes to the system to
The
create more
system.
output, right? Or create more value for customers. That's to me, they're synonymous. Output equals more value for customers. And I don't see that happening in most firms.
Yeah. I mean, that's why it's so important, like when I've worked with clients to help them think about their resource allocation as a part of their strategy management system, you have to bring the leadership team together so that they're all looking at the portfolio of investments that they could make to support the business and make choices as a team about which ones they're going to invest in going forward. And also thinking about that not as like this annual process, but making it more dynamic, whether it's quarterly, whether it's a rolling forecast or what have you, you're sort of being more dynamic about how you, to your point, allocating those resources based on where you see the value creation coming from. I think
Hmm.
that doesn't happen often enough. It is based on individual units. Who was the last person to be more persuasive at convincing the CEO, that this effort was going to work, as opposed to a collective looking system wide and thinking about what's best for the system, regardless of whether it's in my area or not.
Right. And the budgeting process typically in most firms is like a competitive process um, for resources within that functional structure, right? Who can argue the most or most effectively for their bit of that overall budget as compared to how do we optimize the system to create more output. right? And I
Yeah.
think that,
Yeah.
that's a miss for most businesses. So I think then fundamentally what we end up doing is leaving a ton of value on the table by sub-optimizing within a structure, um, and not necessarily optimizing the total value. So to me,
Yeah.
that's a miss.
So I have a question for you. So when we think about efficiency and removal of waste from the system, do you think that there is some value in allowing some waste in the system? Do you see a need for strategic waste in the system?
Strategic waste in the system. Look, that's a super question, right? So let me answer this question by saying that, for example, um, if you were myopically focused on removing all waste at the expense of any other objective, okay, um, you may not, for example, be allocating time for innovation or growth, for example, right? So
Hmm.
let's say, for example, that I wanted to A/B test. This isn't a real example, but if I wanted to A/B test two production lines in a factory to deliver different products, right? Uh,
Hmm.
and let's say, for example, one product was a commodity or really low margin product, right? And another product was a very high margin product in demand where we had some IP that made us a unique producer of that particular product, right? So if you were in a complete efficiency mindset for those two lines, right? You would prioritize taking waste out against all other things, and probably you would have, line A would be highly productive in a sense that, it's delivering that unit out of that line with zero waste and high quality. Line B, same thing. Okay. However, um, what you may end up finding is that for line B, uh, actually, we may want to experiment with different formulations, which might create more waste, which then,
Hmm.
but the return on that sort of that value to the customer might be much higher. So if I was in a myopic mindset just to eliminate the waste, I would get one result, which is the same product with high quality every single time. Or I might get a different view if I say, well, is there a different configuration of this recipe project product or whatever to create more value to the customer? I'm actually going to deliberately create some of that waste. I just conjured up this example, but the point is, if you're
Right.
solving for customer value, some of that waste might be acceptable. Um, Another example of that might be I might tolerate waste in things that don't really matter to the customer, to your original point, um,
Mm.
because I want to invest more of my marginal effort to focus on creating efficient outcomes for the things that do drive that customer value. And then I also might want to trade off um, a little bit of waste. Probably be careful with quality, but I might want to trade off a little bit of that to create more agility too, right?
Yes.
So if I'm going to create something that's super rigid, that is always going to deliver the same thing, but has no flexibility to change, that's problematic too. So I think we have to be careful not to, I don't see organizations as black boxes in a sense that um, you're never going to create the perfect process. And more often than not, you're going to need to change that process to adapt to different market dynamics relatively quickly. So I don't know. I might see an opportunity where I could accept a little bit of waste and maybe even a little bit of quality, to be first to market if I needed to, um, which is sort of fundamental to the lean startup philosophy in software, where, okay, we can have some waste, but we're going to get there first. And when we get there first,
Right.
our customer is going to reward us for that. And then over time, we'll stabilize our process and then we'll get to the next thing first. So I think that's more and more the way we have to think about that issue in firms in general.
Yeah, the link you brought up between waste and agility was what I was thinking about too, because I was thinking when you think about the pandemic. And you think about the supply chain disruption, for example, in the auto industry, and how, their focus on just in time, was really a hindrance to them. It really disrupted. They had no flexibility in the system that would allow them to continue to manufacture because this way the supply chain was set up and their focus on just in time they didn't have enough strategic waste in the system to give them that agility. So I
And in
do,
that sense, that waste is inventory, right, Rondo? So,
right,
that just in time is basically the theory of just in time, which works very well in stable market conditions, not so well in very
right.
stable market conditions. But the theory of just in time is inventory equals waste, and therefore we must reduce inventory. So, know, you can make the argument that that wasn't necessarily appropriate. But
And what does that mean? Like, do you have a strategic um inventory that you keep as a stopgap for maybe future issues like that could happen that you would at least have some flexibility in the system? You know what I mean?
Well, look, this is a complex topic. We could probably have a whole nother podcast on it. It's called buffer stock, right?
Buffer
So,
stop, right,
what sort of buffer stock do you want to carry for that contingency? But that buffer stock consumes capital, so it's problematic, right? So, this is my earlier point in the in the 2010s when the cost of capital was super low, nobody cared, so people would carry more buffer stock. But I think also having a network of alternative supply to be able to drive that is another option. There's lots of options to be able to manage that, but I think all
hmm
things equal, having an efficient organization is less inventory, but the trade-off of being market responsive and being able to achieve, shifting customer demand, whether there's a pandemic or not, is
right.
is valuable. So, it's a tricky one. So,
And
for
so, and
example,
so maybe to your point, maybe there needs to be a conversation around how do we balance efficiency with resiliency? Like what's the right balance for us? We don't want to be so efficient that we're so rigid that we can't adapt and change quickly if we need to. But we want to also make sure that we're efficient enough that we're delivering enough actual productivity because we've got savings that we can invest in other, high value creation opportunities inside the organization.
right. So, and this is a challenge that's ongoing right now with particularly a lot of manufacturing businesses that are thinking about, for example, onshoring manufacturing and reducing dependency on, say, manufacturing in China, which,
hmm
has long lead times and does require buffer stock, both stock in transit and stock in warehouses and distribution centers and so forth to be able to manage that. And as that becomes less certain, the need to create well, at least the need to do the numbers on whether or not having local manufacturing, perhaps at a much higher cost, um, which allows you to be more flexible to your local demand requirements, is something I think virtually every operations manager on the planet is sort of working through now. But there obviously are certain situations where you may accept a higher cost to deliver, i.e., through your own manufacturing or holding your own stock, uh,
hmm
to create more market responsiveness, therefore more resilience. But it's a tricky one because you have to find that balance, um, and you may not be able to, like, unless you can e express that additional cost in terms of additional value to the customer, your margins
Right,
will be squeezed, right?
right.
And then you're less competitive. And if you're less competitive, then your output's going to be lower by comparison to your competitor. Therefore, you're losing the productivity war between you and your competition. So that isn't a good place to be. Um, so my point there is, if you do make that call, then you need to be able to translate that market responsiveness into additional value to the customer, which then shows
Right.
up either in a higher price or a different value proposition where the customer is willing to trade more value with you for that capability than than they might otherwise have before. So you have to reframe the problem with the customer and monetize those changes. So a
Hmm.
purely
Hmm.
efficient organization will try to put that capability into their business, squeeze as much as possible, and not think about reframing the value. That's a less productive firm. And a perfect example where that efficiency would come at the expense of productivity.
And that firm is most likely competing on price. Is that a fair assumption?
Well, all things equal, that firm will be competing on a zero-sum competition with their, you know, is it on price? Maybe. They may be competing on something else, right? It could be a
Mm,
brand or whatever. But if you have competitor A and competitor B, competitor A is offshoring their manufacturing from China, say, for example, and they have big fat 40% margins, and competitor B is onshoring and their margins are 20%. And they're competing on a level playing field in the market. In other words, competitor B has not been able to communicate that additional value for doing that to the customer and reframe the problem to the customer to monetize that at 40 or greater percent margin, then they're losing in terms of productivity because they've held the customer value constant, right?
constant, right.
That's my
Hmm.
point. So you could have a really, so then basically from an efficiency point of view, in that scenario, sourcing from China is more efficient than sourcing from, so then in onshoring. Okay. But
Hmm.
so therefore, competitor A that's offshoring their manufacturing is winning on productivity. But in order to create additional value, you have to take it the next step and say, how do I turn this indigenous manufacturing into additional value to the customer, right? I can
Yeah,
be much more responsive to your needs. Therefore, you don't need to carry customer, you don't need to carry as much stock. That will save you this much money. Therefore, you're going to pay a higher price for this product, blah, 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 right? So
right.
that's reframing the problem to both your customers and your advantage, and to look at total system productivity as compared to just the efficiency of the manufacturing, as an
Yeah.
example. Yeah. Anyway, we could nerd out on this all day, but
Exactly.
right. But anyway, I just think it's important for leaders to understand the difference, and that I also think it's important, particularly in this volatile environment, for business leaders to think more carefully about productivity and efficiency and where to prioritize those investments, and to start to build the muscle to improve both of these things through techniques that we mentioned earlier that are probably wanting a bit. And I think a lot of firms have gotten lazy, not putting the energy into building that sort of capability.
Yeah, and I would also add that I think our listeners should be asking themselves whether they're really focusing on creating value for customers. Like, is that the ultimate metric that they're looking at? Value creation as opposed to extracting value from customers or the market. And so it's like a mindset shift that you have to make because if you focus on value creation, I think that you will naturally be thinking more about how is your efficiency, are your efficiency activities driving productivity for your organization.
No, I think that's a great place to end, Rondo. That's a good punchline for the podcast. So, well, thanks. It was really interesting to explore this, our final episode in the series on productivity, adding a bit of a wrinkle on firm productivity and efficiency. So, thank you, Rondo, and
Thank you, Matt.
we'll see you next time around. Come find us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. And for a blog version of this podcast, you can see us on insurgentsgroup.com, where all of our podcasts are conveniently truncated into short blogs for those of you who want to read rather than watch. Have a great one.
Have a great one.
All the best.